Perhaps the only thing more famous around the world than the Linnean Society is today's speaker, David Lindo. He is, as I mentioned, better known by many as the urban birder. So David is an incredible champion of the natural world. He's a broadcaster, writer, speaker, tour leader, and educator with an amazing, important mission to engage people in cities around the world with the environment through the medium of birds. Among his books include The Urban Birder, Tales from Concrete Jungles, um, Urban Birder, How to Be an Urban Birder, and The Extraordinary World of Birds. He has many accolades, but from the Linnean Society, we were very proud to award David with the H.H. Bloomer Award last year, which is an award given to people who really inspire people about the natural world. And one of the things that we really recognized in our awarding David of the H.H. Bloomer Award was how he has an incredible way of engaging people about the natural world, especially people who maybe don't automatically have that connection or who haven't had the opportunity to have that connection. Now, this is something that's really dear to us at the Linnean Society. And so very much the work that David does is inspiring to us and really influences what we are trying to do at the Society. Now, rather than talking on and on about David, I think I should hand over because I know he's going to tell us a lot about his experience and what really has inspired him and inspired his career in his talk, A World of Urban Birds. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anjali, and also Padma and the Linnean Society for actually having me here today. It's been a long time coming, actually, because I've actually, I remember Padma reaching out to me a year ago about this, and I've been sitting here with bated breath ever since. So at last I'm here, and thank you all for those who have come out in the cold to actually watch this talk. So appreciate that. Right, well, this is a conversation, or should I say a monologue really, talking about the world of urban birds. It's really incredible to think that officially they say that there's roughly 20% of all species of birds found in urban areas. That's roughly about 2,000 species. I actually think there's more because in many cities, when you go to many cities and you Google to see what kind of birds you can see, often there's no information there at all. And in fact, for example, I myself Googled Seville in Spain about 3 years ago because I was writing a piece about urban birding in Seville, and all the leads went out of town, you know, into the middle of the countryside to Doñana, which is an amazing reserve, but it's actually not in Seville itself. So you become an urban explorer. You know, you don your binoculars, you get out in the streets practically, and you find birds. And I find that really exciting. And in fact, you know, during the course of this talk, hopefully you'll see that too. Now, many of you may be wondering, you know, what are my origins? How did I get into birding? And I'm sure you'd be thinking that. Well, let me put that to rest. This is what happened. I was born interested in birds, and I've always had that interest, I think, since a previous life. I was born in northwest London, raised in Wembley, and I was in a predominantly black and Irish neighborhood, and there was no one around me, not even my family, that shared my interest. So it was a bit difficult, but in the end, I actually taught myself. And I guess the only person that really kind of helped me was my mum. She didn't really understand why I had this interest, but she fed me information. She'd get me books every now and again, you know, and I hassled her at the age of 8 to get me a pair of binoculars, and she couldn't afford it. But, you know, eventually she managed to scrimp and save and actually get a pair from Dixon's. Remember Dixon's? On HP for £16.99. And basically she paid it on hire purchase. And I must say that maybe 12 years ago, I paid her off and we're all totally square. So basically I was interested in birds. It developed and developed. I didn't actually meet anyone in terms of birding until I was about 11 years old. And by that point, I was well down the line. And incidentally, right at the very beginning, just to sort of track back a bit, My initial interest in natural history was, in fact, with invertebrates, actually not birds. And when I was watching the invertebrates, I realized that they were being fed upon by birds, and then that was that. I was taken away. During the course of my life, I've actually not worked in conservation at all. I was in sales and marketing. And during that period of time, I say from the age of 14 until as recently as maybe 15, 16 years ago, I was also a DJ. I was out there playing at clubs, um, upmarket bars, celebrity parties, film openings, all that sort of stuff. And I didn't look like this all the time. This was actually a Studio 54 night, and I was wearing a wig. And that was only, 15 or 16 years ago. A lot has changed since then, I must say. 16 years ago, I was born as the urban birder, and I had a lucky break effectively from the BBC, who approached me and asked if I would like to go on Spring Watch to talk about my local patch in London, northwest London, well, actually West London, which is Wormwood Scrubs. And of course, I said yes. And I did the piece. And then from that point, I realized actually this is my calling. And I put all my efforts into becoming a conservationist, a broadcaster, writer, leading tours and giving talks, including things like this, as well as just basically advising governments and tourist boards on urban wildlife issues. So I remember 15 years ago, I started writing for a magazine called Birdwatching Magazine, and I had a column which was, funny enough, called Urban Birding. And I was writing about various bits of urban birding, aspects of urban birding, and then I decided, you know what, maybe I should go somewhere. So I went to Paris. I remember getting on the Eurotunnel, getting to Paris. I paid for the train trip. I paid for a crummy hotel in Paris. I went during the worst weekend possible. It was pouring with snow. It's really cold. Didn't see an awful lot. And then I thought to myself, why am I doing this? Maybe there's another way of doing this. So I remember going back home and then getting on the phone to the Turkish tourist board and saying to them, hello, my name is David Lindo. I am also known as the Urban Birder. Pause. No response. Anyway, I think that I could write an article about Istanbul and get people to come and visit your city for the purposes of watching wildlife. There was a pause. And then the lady said, that is a good idea, she said. But you're not coming for a day or two. You're going to come for a week. We're going to put you up in a hotel. We're going to pay for your flight. We're going to get you a guide. You're there. And I was thinking, that's it. So I went to Istanbul, and I'm sure you know where it is, but it's where East meets West, as they say, and an amazing place. And I remember being really excited on the plane, getting out there, and I managed to get the tourism board to actually allow me to bring a photographer with me as well. I didn't know this guy, and he turned up on the flight later than me. So eventually, when we met at 10 o'clock in the evening, we were heading to our hotel, and this guy was a bit of a drinker, unbeknown to me, and he said, let's stop on an off license. And I was thinking, really? So we stopped at an off license, and basically he bought a massive bottle of vodka. We went back to the hotel, and I indulged in the vodka as well. And I don't normally drink that sort of stuff, but by 5 o'clock in the morning even, I was totally and utterly out of it. And we were meeting the guide at 5:30 in the morning, and this was me at 5:20. I was completely gone. So during the course of the day, it was really terrible. I felt so sick. I felt really kind of drunk still. I really was out of sorts, and my guide must have thought, what kind of journalist is he coming out here and sort of being, like a zombie? And I actually spent most of my time in a horizontal position when we should have been out birding. I decided to lie on my back on bits of grass which were flea ridden and what have you. So it's just ridiculous. But anyway, the following day, I woke up and I was a lot better. And we were in the car, and I thought to myself, my guide must think that I'm really, not worth being in the car. And as we're driving along, I saw this bird sitting on a wire through the corner of my eye. And I said to the driver, I said to the guide, I said, I've just seen a bee eater. And he said to me, a bee eater? This is late September, early October. There's no chance. They've all gone to Africa. I said, it's a bee eater. Turn the car around. I was taking a big risk, and I thought to myself, if I get this wrong, that's it. He's going to think that I am totally useless. We turned the car around, and there, sitting on the wire, was a bee eater. And I thought, whew, I can carry on now. And I felt very happy that I actually was able to sort of, in front of my peer, look as if I actually knew what I was talking about. So we had a really good time in Turkey. We saw lots of really nice, interesting birds. I've got a couple samples for you. In Istanbul, we saw this bird called a red-fronted serin, which is a very cute little thing, about a third smaller than the sparrow, with that beautiful little red blob in front of its head. And also, there are many people in Istanbul itself who are so friendly. You know, they come up and ask you what they were doing, what you were doing. So I was basically showing people in the streets walking past the birds that we're looking at. And this guy, in fact, this actual lake is really interesting because I'm not sure what it's called. I can't remember. The bridge is like a very undulating bridge, very interesting architecture, and it's quite an old bridge as well. But we were looking at flamingos and a whole massive flock of these birds, slender-billed gulls, that I'd never seen in an urban environment before. And it was really amazing to touch base with all so many birds like that. By the way, these birds, for those who are birders out there watching this, they look very similar to black-headed gulls. They share the same white forewing and, you know, sort of similar kind of vibe of a black-headed gull, but they've got slightly longer, narrower heads and neck and a longer bill. I mean, they're quite distinctive when you see them, but it was great to see such a massive flock. And I thought to myself, whilst in Turkey, this is it. I'm going to make sure that I'm really professional from now on. I'm going to focus on, you know, the job at hand. I'm not going to get involved in anything else and deviate in any way to get myself in trouble. And interestingly, I think 2 trips later, I was invited to Finland to watch for bears in a bear hide on the border of Finland and Russia. And I remember my guide at the time saying to me, David, there's this bird called a red-flanked bluetail, which I'd never seen before. And he said to me, there's a colony up the road, 10 kilometers up the road. Do you want to see them? I said, no, I'm here to watch for bears, and that's what I'm doing. Well, 16 years later, I still have not seen a red-flanked bluetail. And in fact, they've become, well, they were originally a very rare vagrant in the UK, and now they actually turn up every year. Maybe 5 or 6, even up to 10 birds turn up, and I've yet to see one. But I vowed when I was in Finland never to twitch a red-flanked bluetail. And by the way, twitch, for those who don't know, twitching is when you race after rare birds, whereas birding is when you relax and just see what's around you. But then there's nothing wrong with twitching, because twitchers bird and birders twitch. So let me tell you about what I'm doing now, really. And also let me take you on a journey at the same time, because I'm speaking to you not from London, despite my background, both physically and mentally. I'm actually speaking to you from Spain, and I'm in a region which is called Extremadura, which is circled here. And I'm not sure how many of you know of Extremadura, but it is a region which is well known by birders and people interested in wildlife, but other people often don't know of it and never heard of it. It is effectively twice the size of Wales. It's a massive area. It borders Portugal to the west, and to the south you've got Seville, and to the northeast you have Madrid. It's got a population of just over 1 million, so it's very sparsely populated. In fact, it's very rural. And I live currently in a town, or a city actually, called Cáceres. You can see it on the map there. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to tell you about a place called Mérida. If you look further south, Mérida, which is where I actually have been based. Well, I was based there for 6 years. I've been in Spain now, or based in Spain for 7 years now, and I spent 6 of those years in Mérida. And by that, I was actually, what I mean was I was sort of coming back there, spending a week or 2 or 3 weeks, and then spending the rest of the time in England and elsewhere. That all changed when the pandemic came in, because I was in Spain at the time, and I went to my apartment thinking I'll be locked down for 2 weeks, and ended up being there for a year. So the region split into two provinces. The northern region is called Cathras province, should I say, and the southern region, you can probably make out a squiggly line separating the two regions, is called the Badajoz region. So they are the two areas of Extremadura, quite different in character. The northern province is quite mountainous, forested, whereas the southern province, there's quite a lot of farmland. There's lots of areas of plain, and there's also quite a lot of rice fields as well. So they're quite different. But the scenery, as far as I'm concerned, is quite stunning. People think of Extremadura as being totally, I mean, the people that know of Extremadura think it's totally sort of blonde during the summer, so hot, because it does actually get pretty hot during the summer, up to 44 degrees or maybe more sometimes. This year has been particularly hot. But the winter time, as it is now, is much more agreeable. I mean, the top temperature so far has been around about 15 degrees. And at night it may sink to zero, maybe -1 in some areas, but it quickly regains the temperature during the course of the morning the following day. But it's a land of contrasts. You got mountains, you got fantastic wooded valleys, you got rivers, you got reservoirs, you got areas of what seems like savanna. You got rice fields, as I said earlier. You've also got a habitat called dehesa, which I'll tell you about in a second. Such a different range, and I find the whole area almost as a complete and utter local patch. I just want to explore all of it. But as I said earlier, it's well visited by people, in terms of people looking for birds and tourism in natural history. But a lot of people tend to go to the same 5 places. And for those who know of Extremadura, you might find the places like Monfragüe and Trujillo, and even the Cathras Plains, being familiar, because they're the places that people tend to make a beeline for. But there's so many other places, and practically anywhere you look, there is somewhere to go birding. And in fact, 74% of the land is actually noticed as an area of importance for nature. So it's actually, and even urban areas. I think there's 19 important bird areas within urban areas. So the whole region is fantastic for wildlife. Now, I mentioned dehesa earlier. This is a dehesa landscape. Dehesa is effectively two species of oak. There's home oak, and I always forget the other oak species, but there's 2 species of oak. They've been farmed this way for centuries, and they allow the Extremadurans allow their black Iberian pigs to wander in this landscape, free range, eating the acorns, and their flesh apparently is of the best quality in the world. I mean, it's really expensive to buy this meat, but they are allowed to roam this area. But the good thing for me is that during the late part of winter, just before it starts breaking into spring, you have thousands of cranes that winter in the region, that switch from feeding in the fields and rice fields on seeds and what have you, to coming into this area to feed on acorns as well before they migrate north to Northern Europe. But this is a landscape that people often think of when they think of Extremadura. Burnt, blonde, hot, which it is. But this is only a part of it. This is the plains of Cathras, and that actually where I'm based, is just right on the right hand side of this image where the mountains are. It's just a bit right. So it's just on the outskirts of the city, and it's a reservoir. And like Scotland, there are many bodies of water in Extremadura, despite the fact that people think it's very arid. And like Scotland, you go to lochs, and some of the lochs are, devoid of birds, and other lochs you go to, there's birds there. It's a similar thing in Spain or in Extremadura. You go to some of these reservoirs, and you don't see anything. This is one example, actually. I come here, and you're lucky to see a few mallards and a few other birds, cormorants and coots, but not much. But during the winter, it's frequented in the evenings by thousands upon thousands of gulls. And I often spend time driving around the edge of the reservoir, stopping in one spot and trying to watch the gulls as they come in to see if I can find any unusual species amongst them. The great thing about Extremadura as well, and I think the rest of Spain, is that it's open access practically. I mean, any reservoir you come to, there's normally a path or a track all the way around it, which is usually used by fishermen. So you can actually drive around, especially in the summer when it's really hot. You can stay in your car and go on a safari. But it's not always sunny. I mean, for the last 2 weeks here in Extremadura, it's been pouring with rain. In fact, there's been quite a lot of flooding. And that's been as a juxtaposition to what happened during the summer and spring when there was hardly any rain at all. So we seem to have had it all in one go. But what I love about the region is the big open skies. And also, you go to areas of woodland and you can walk around for ages. This particular area of woodland, which is actually another dehesa, so it's cork oak woodland. This area I remember last year quite well, actually, because last year, November the 18th, I was in England on my way back to Spain, and the news broke that a red-flanked bluetail, the very bird I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, had turned up here. It was the first record for Extremadura, and it was right next door to Merida, where I was living. So this is actually quite close to the city. I was thinking, oh, please let it be there when I get back from, my flights. I flew down on the 18th. On the 19th, I rushed there at dawn. I wandered around this wood for 4 hours. I didn't see a thing. And I think my thing with the red flank bluetail is a bit of a curse. I'm not allowed, the forces will not allow me to twitch it. I'll have to find my own bird. But anyway, it's a beautiful woodland, and the bird itself, by the way, was chased off by a very aggressive robin, so it didn't put robins in my good books either. But anyway, it's a really nice enchanted forest to walk around, and I tell you what, there's so many of these areas in Extremadura. Everywhere you turn, there's somewhere else to go. There's also plenty of these kind of mountainous regions too. This is my friend Martin, and we were in this beautiful place called Cabana, and we were looking for a bird called a wall creeper, which is a very rare visitor to Extremadura. For those who know, you normally think of them being in the Himalayas, and there's a few in the Alps and places like that. They're very much a mountain bird, and they are very rarely discovered in Extremadura. And I think partially because of the vast size of the region and the lack of birders. I mean, I'm talking maybe 40 regular birders in an area twice the size of Wales or the size of Switzerland, or if you're from America, just under the size of Kentucky. I have that amount of birders living on my street in London, so it just shows you that it's sparsely covered and there's so much more to be looking out for. And, I just loved walking around in spring, especially, and seeing all the areas where they don't sort of automatically chop down vegetation for the sake of making it short and neat, in inverted commas. I love the fact that they leave a lot of areas to be wild, as it should be, really. And as I say, you walk down drive down various tracks, and you just find yourself in these wonderlands, as far as I'm concerned, for birding. This particular place, again, not too far from Merida, if you can see the stone kind of walls going up the slope, I've sort of sat at the base of that slope looking up, and I've found all sorts of really interesting birds, such as black wheatear, which is it's a speciality of Spain, decreasing, but I've seen 2 or 3, obviously must be pairs, up in those slopes, and other birds as well, including the ring ouzel, my favorite bird, which I'll talk about later, which is a thrush, and I've seen that here as well, which is a rare visitor to Extremadura. I can talk all night about how wonderful it is to wander through this beautiful region. This is in a place called the Jerte Valley, which is very famous for its cherry production. It's the cherry producing valley of, or cherry producing area of Extremadura. And walking down country lanes, it's just lovely to see life as it was. You feel like you've gone back in time almost, because life is, still is as it was 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. This is the edge of Merida where I was staying, and I remember the day we were allowed to walk around for the first time in 3 months. I walked across the city, which wasn't far, it's only about 40 minutes, to come to the edge of town where there was this kind of area of sort of wet grassland. And I remember standing here, the sun was rising, and listening to nightingales singing and to other birds like Chetty's warblers and reed warblers, and thinking, wow, this is just incredible. It's amazing what 3 months of incarceration can do to you, because in Spain the lockdown was quite draconian. We weren't allowed out, basically, even for exercise, only to go to the store. So it was like being let out of prison for after 3 months, and it was incredible feeling. But even walking around Merida, there's lots of areas that you would at first glance think, oh, that's not good for birding, but in fact they are. This is one of the many sites where they started building. They laid down the foundation, or at least dug out the foundations for buildings, and the credit crunch came, and basically they've been left derelict. And these kind of places are homes for things like little owls, and during the summer months you got bee eaters nesting in the embankment at the back there, and also lots of finches come down to feed. It's just everywhere you look there's birds. And there's also a river that ran past where I lived. It's called the Guadiana River, which flows, I don't know where it starts, but it ends up through Portugal into the Atlantic. And it's an amazing river because there is so much life. You go there. I remember when I was allowed to go for walks, I'd come here and sit by the bank, and I'd see kingfishers, and I'd see birds called penduline tits come really close to me. And on the water there'd be great crested grebes and cormorants, and you can also hear and see little bitterns. It was incredible. And the river itself runs under one of the main features of Merida. Merida is actually in fact, is a Roman city of 60,000. So again, it's a gigantic village, more than a city. It was the capital of Rome, or the Romans, should I say. It was the capital for the Romans outside Rome. And the bridge here, which is imaginatively called the Roman Bridge, is the world's oldest and longest still in use, 2,000 years old and nearly a kilometre long, and is pedestrianised. But it's also one of the best places, certainly in the region, to see certain birds. But you can walk, especially in spring, you can walk 30 feet and take 30 minutes walking those 30 feet, and you'll be hearing and seeing 30 different species of bird. It's just incredible. And it's a beautiful place as well. There's a bridge on the left, and the city is, as you can see in the background, but also behind me is also the new city as well. So it spans across both sides of the river, and there's lots of habitat there for wildlife, including otters. I've seen otters from the bridge as well. It's just incredible. And I take people here when I lead tours to Extremadura. So if you have a fancy coming to Extremadura, I'm your man. I'll take you around to places that people don't take you to normally, even though the Roman Bridge is actually on the naturalist tourist map, because the people do come to see certain birds. And let me tell you about one thing. There are so many birds in Extremadura. It's incredible. I'm talking about individual birds. We've with the survey, the winter surveys, the winter atlasing work that's been done over the years, it's come to light that Extremadura has probably the most amount of individual wintering birds of any area in Western Europe, and that's incredible. And often you can be walking down a country lane, and suddenly a whole flock of sparrows will just burst out of a tree or out of the ground. You might have up to these are Spanish sparrows. You might have up to 500 of these birds in one big flock or more, and then other species also flock. I mean, it's just incredible the number of birds that you can see. But going back to the Roman Bridge and my urban birding there, I remember visiting this bridge over a year and going there about 12 times during the course of a year, and seeing 120 different species in 12 visits. And when you put that into perspective, I spent 25 years in Wormwood Scrubs, not the prison, by the way, but in the park, and saw 150 species in 25 years. So it shows you the difference. This is one species that people come to see. It's called the Western swamp hen. It's like a moorhen on steroids. Imagine a moorhen twice the size of a moorhen, but it has this it has this amazing sorry, I'm going too far back now. It has these amazing feet that are so big, and a massive conch of a bill. It's just incredible to see this bird. It's one of those birds that people, as I say, it's on their hit list to come and see. And it's off the bridge. It's probably one of the best places to be able to see them. They're not particularly shy, but they walk in and out of cover with equal ease. And as you probably saw in my other slides here, let me just go forward. We've got lots of other birds in and around the city to be enjoyed. I mean, cattle egrets, which have now finally colonized the UK. In Spain, certainly in that part of Spain, they're very, very common. I used to see flights of them every evening heading back to their roosts every evening. And also during the winter, plenty of blackcaps, even though they are also there during the summer. These birds come and spend the winter, and they normally probably come from even Britain to fly down and winter in this particular region. And there's other birds like the black redstart, which is a bird that is found in the UK, but it's one of the rarest breeding birds in the UK. I think their population is between 20 pairs to no more than 40 pairs during the summer, and in the winter the numbers are augmented by migrants from the continents. So maybe up to 500 birds might be around, but not many in the whole country. And I've often wondered why they're so scarce in the UK, but as soon as you cross the channel into Europe, they're very common. And part of the reason, I think, is because of competition with robins. Robins hate anything with a red tail. In fact, anything with a bit of red in it, the same sort of size as they are, they'll attack it. And they are dominant over black redstarts. So that's why you don't see so many, and the ones that do exist in the UK tend to be in habitats where you don't normally see robins, so derelict buildings. What's great about this bird for me personally is that the very first breeding pair ever to be discovered in the UK was in London, in Wembley, land of my birth, when they were building Wembley Stadium in 1922 or 23. So that's a great piece of history. But when you go to the continent and in Extremadura, for example, they're very common. I mean, it's particularly in winter, but in the summer you find them in the mountain villages, breeding up in the mountain areas. Whenever you look up, you will always, almost guaranteed, especially if it's a sunny day, you'll almost always see a raptor of some sort. This is the Western Palearctic's, i.e. Europe and beyond slightly, biggest raptor you can possibly get, the black vulture or cinereous vulture. I've often seen them sitting in fields and they look like sheep. They're massive. There's 900 pairs breeding, or over 900 pairs breeding in the region. And some of those birds, in fact, you can see them anywhere, even in the middle of the city. One of the best places I go to see them is actually at the city dump, because they come down maybe 20 or 30 of them, and they often fly really low over your head, affording really good photographic opportunities. The species itself is found discontinuously from Iberia eastwards towards Mongolia, but nowhere as common as they are in Extremadura. In fact, there's a breeding program going on where they are collecting birds and actually releasing them in areas that need them, such as Bulgaria. And the other vulture there, in fact, there's two other species. There's the griffin vulture, which is, I think there's about 4.5, nearly 5,000 pairs of those. And then there's also Egyptian vultures as well. So it's incredible to be, just south of the UK, but have such an amazing different avifauna, including vultures, and the vultures are increasing, which is really, really great news. One of the classic birds of the region, and an urban bird as far as I'm concerned, is the hoopoe, and very gorgeous. It's one of those birds that birders, when they come to the region, they're just dying to see. They're very common, and during the winter, even though a lot of them do move off somewhere, they're probably sort of flying south to Africa maybe, we've still got quite a lot of them hanging around here in the region. In fact, I've seen maybe 5 or 6 today myself, and I showed my mum. My mum's with me at the moment spending Christmas, and I took her birding. She's not a birder, but she saw one and she couldn't believe how pretty it was. But if you ever approach its nest hole, it will stink of rotting meat because that's the smell they like to have in their homes. And if there was a bird at home, it may poke its head out of its nest hole and vomit over you. So as much as they're beautiful, they also have a bit of a darker side. During the autumn, we have all sorts of passage migrants coming through, heading south. One of the typical birds is this bird. This is a pied flycatcher, and they come through in their thousands. I mean, in city parks and even in the streets, you'll see them in the trees sallying after insects. Beautiful birds. On the way back north, you see less of them because when birds migrate in the spring, they're more concerned about getting to their territories and getting set up, the males in particular. But during that time of year, they're beautiful. They're black and white, very bold black and white. This time of year, they've become more brown like this particular bird. Another classic bird that can be found in the middle of Merida, but also in almost any wetland you come to in Extremadura, is the long-legged there, the black-winged stilt with the massive long legs. They've got the longest legs in proportion of their size of any bird, and I know they are becoming a bit more regular in the UK, but it's just great to have them on your doorstep and you can see them whenever you want, and you could just never get tired of looking at black-winged stilts. When I used to live in Merida, used to go to the supermarket, and I discovered that there was an area of derelict land behind the supermarket, which I used to watch because as an urban birder, you begin to see the world as a bird would. So instead of seeing dereliction, you're seeing crags and little mounds of cliffs and stuff. And in amongst all of that stuff, I realized that there were little owls. I found maybe 4 different pairs at the back of my local supermarket, which I used to go and watch on a regular basis, especially in the evenings. And one evening, I was there watching a couple of adults with some young birds when a barn owl flew over. And barn owls are pretty rare in Extremadura. In fact, I've never seen one since in the region. So that was a magic night. Another classic bird to be found in the city as well as out in the middle of nowhere in the countryside is the Iberian magpie, also known or used to be known as the azure-winged magpie. And this bird actually is an endemic, only found in Iberia, in southern Iberia, in the Mediterranean basin. Interestingly, in Merida, it was never that common and not that approachable. But in the city I'm in now, Cáceres, you can actually go to the main park in the city, and you can get really close to them and get good photographic opportunities. So that's one bird that, again, is much sought after when people turn up to Extremadura for birding. You can't leave Extremadura without seeing an Iberian magpie, nor can you leave without seeing storks. This is not the romantic picture you might think of, because normally they're standing on top of some church steeple on top of a nest looking very elegant and looking down at you. This is the other side of their lives, hanging out in landfill sites. In fact, the main landfill site in the region, which is in Merida, and sometimes I can see up to 500 gathered by the tractors trying to gobble up any refuge that they can eat, and they don't look clean. Some of them are very dirty looking indeed. In fact, these guys have obviously had a good wash and brush up because I can tell you what, they look sometimes pretty manky. Now, I could actually talk to you all night about all the different places I've been to. I feel like I'm the luckiest man on 2 legs with a pair of binoculars. I've been, since I've started my whole thing as the urban birder, my crusade, as it were, I've visited maybe 350 different cities. So if we were to talk about each and every one, we might have to sort of camp down and stay here till maybe New Year's Day. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to think to myself about the world itself and maybe try and name 1 or 2 species from each kind of block of region, like for example North America and just try and talk through some of the birds I've met along my way that have reminded me of that particular continent. And what better place to start than in North America itself, a place that I visited on many, many occasions in my previous life when I used to be. One thing I used to do as well was an assistant to a director that made music videos and commercials. And we used to go to Los Angeles every year for 13 years, sometimes staying as long as 3 months. So I began to really get to know that city and knew all the local spots and all the birds. And plus, I visited other areas like New York and loads of other places. So I got quite a good knowledge. In fact, if anything, after Europe, North America is my spot where I know a lot of the birds. So I'm going to talk about two species now. One species that I really was happy to see, and it was actually a bird I would never expect to see in an urban area, is a bird called the trumpeter swan. Now, its history is that in the past it was in danger of extinction due to overhunting. And I saw these birds in a wetland reserve on the outskirts of Cleveland in Ohio. And the great thing about this particular bird, it always captured my imagination as a kid because it's the world's biggest swan. It's actually, if you can imagine the mute swan, our swan is 60 inches. This is apparently 65 inches. So it just tips it in terms of size. It also has a trumpeting call, which I've not heard before actually, but it's just the fact that as a kid, I always thought I'd never see one. And to think that, their comeback has been so good that they're now even inhabiting areas within urban areas, which is great. So it was really lovely to see and catch up with a trumpeter swan. The other bird that I always love seeing, despite the fact it's very common in North America, is the American robin, so named by homesick travelers, or should I say settlers from Europe, who saw, as soon as they stepped foot on the East Coast, they saw these thrushes with reddish fronts and thought, right, robin. And I've started a campaign, a one-man campaign, to try and change the name to red-bellied or red-fronted thrush, because it's not a robin, folks. A robin is a completely different bird. This is to all effects a blackbird, but with red and grey instead. But I love them, and so do the Americans. In some states, particularly the ones in the northeast, they are sort of the harbingers of spring. They are very migratory. They turn up in the spring and spend the summer, then they move off. So they actually migrate a lot, and because of that, they sometimes turn up over on this side of the Atlantic as well. I remember on one occasion, one was found in the garden on Christmas Day in Peckham, which was incredible. But they do turn up elsewhere. So it's a lovely bird, just under the size of a blackbird. The song is kind of similar. You can tell it's a thrush, but it's one of my favorites in North America. If we head a little bit south to Central America, I'm going to cheat a little bit now. I know this is all about urban birds, but when I saw this next bird, I just had to draw breath, and I thought, I love you. You're amazing. The bird in question is the agami heron. It's a denizen of the sort of undergrowth by rivers. It's hardly, it's not often seen. And I saw this bird in Belize in a reserve called the Crooked Tree Lagoon. And I was in a boat with my guide, and we were drifting down this river, I suppose, and we saw this agami heron. It was in the actual, the brush, and I was thinking, this is great. But all of a sudden, it started walking out of the actual undergrowth, and in the end, was standing there in the middle of a branch, literally 6 feet away from me. I couldn't believe it. I thought, oh my God, I couldn't believe that this bird has stepped out like that. And it is incredible to behold. I mean, this photograph does it no justice. I mean, in the light and the sun beaming off its blue iridescence, you would never think it's a heron even. It's just an incredible bird to actually behold. So yeah, the agami heron, if you ever get a chance to visit Central America, Costa Rica, Belize, anywhere like that, get yourself on a boat, float downstream and look out for this guy. It's a fantastic looking bird. Further south, we have, of course, South America. I've visited a few times now, and I think one of the classic birds I see in urban areas there, I mean, there's so many to choose from, but it's the greater kiskadee, so named after its call. It belongs to a family of birds called tyrant flycatchers, of which it is the largest of them. It's about the size of a blackbird. And the tyrant flycatchers, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's the biggest family of birds in the world. I think there's about 350 different species. So it's a massive family. And if you look at any field guide, you'll see any field guide to South America, to any country in South America, especially, you know, if you're looking sort of Colombia down to Peru, Argentina, you'll see a page with tyrant flycatchers all looking like this bird. There's about 11 species of flycatcher which are actually not closely related, but they look just the same. They've got the bandit head thing going on, and they've got the yellow breast in varying degrees. And there's one bird called the boat-billed flycatcher, which looks the dead stamp of a kiskadee, but its bill is massive. And then you've got the social flycatcher, which looks like exactly the same, a doppelganger for the kiskadee, but it's smaller with a smaller beak. And then you got a whole variation of other birds. I mean, you have to look twice to make sure you got the right bird half the time. The other species that really really does it for me is a bird that I led a tour in Peru once, and we went to a place called Cusco, which isn't too far away from Machu Picchu, for those who've been. It's up in the mountains. It's a bit tough for me to breathe there, but anyway, we were out for over half a day in search of this particular bird, walking around the wilderness by this lake, looking for this bird. We couldn't find it anywhere. So we went back to the hotel, sat in the garden. A few of us had a beer to, you know, to wash down our sorrows. And as we sat there, it flew in to the garden and started feeding next to us. It was a bearded mountaineer, a type of hummingbird. What a name, bearded mountaineer. For that name alone, I love it. It's just an incredible bird and very distinctive for all hummingbirds in that area. I mean, there's quite a few species, but it's a very distinctive looking bird with its sort of bluish head, and it's got a scraggly kind of beard, I suppose, when it erects its feathers on its throat. But beautiful bird, and I love the idea of the fact we saw it by chance in so many. In fact, not even by chance, it came to see us. Now, if we head towards the south, we'll eventually get to the Antarctic, and I've been lucky enough to actually lead a couple of tours to the Antarctic, and I know it's a bit of a stretch to talk about urban birding in Antarctica. I know that. However, on the way to Antarctica, especially if you're in Chile, you're going to be in a place called Puntas Arenas, which is the city or town the furthest south of any city or town in Chile. And I remember being there waiting for the boat to take us out to Antarctica, and I was walking along the coast, and I was seeing an array of all the birds you normally saw, but then I saw this bird here in flight, and this bird is a Sabine gull. Now, the history for me with this bird is similar to the red-flanked bluetail. In 1987, there was a massive storm. I don't know if you remember it, and hit sort of southern England and London, destroyed a lot of things. And I was actually on the Isles of Scilly at the time, and I remember in London, there were 12 of these birds, and I'd never seen them before. There were 12 of them in various reservoirs. And by the time I got back to London, of course, they had all gone. So I made a vow never to twitch a Sabine gull. I want to find my own one. And I had opportunities to twitch them, and I actually went and twitched, and I never saw it, similar to the red-flanked bluetail. And then I come to Chile, and I find not only one here, which is a new bird for me, but also it turns out to be Chile's most southerly record of this species ever. Whoa, that was amazing. And this is what it looks like during the summer. It breeds up in the Arctic. It is a stunning gull, and it's really truly pelagic. It's normally just found in the middle of the sea, you know, so to get them inland is actually quite a thing. We cross over the Atlantic to Africa, and again, you got thousands of birds to choose from in terms of representing the country. In fact, the bird that I really wanted to show you, I haven't got a photo of, and it's actually a bird called a pied crow. And I know it sounds ordinary, but I love them. They are so graceful. They look like Maltese crosses flying in the sky. They're very graceful. But I'm going to pick this bird here. It's the the thick-billed raven, also known as a white-naped raven, I think. But anyway, the thick-billed raven, and what a bill this bird's got. Incredible. I saw this actually in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa. I had a little patch at the back of the hotel, which was basically a building site. I have this thing about building sites. People would walk past them, but I think building sites are so interesting because often, as much as they may be building sites, they're actually quite undisturbed. And I found quite a lot of species just in my little patch around the back of the hotel. Over in Asia, well, again, you've got so many birds to choose from. I've been to a few places in Asia, but for me, the bird that takes it is this bird. It's called the Oriental White Stork. Now, this bird has an interesting story. It has an interesting story because it was extinct in Japan, and long story short, some school children in Toyooka even, appealed to the mayor to stop people from cultivating rice using chemicals because it's killing all the food that this bird would eat, and that's why they became extinct, and go organic. And to his credit, he did that. He made everyone go organic, and they managed to introduce them again, and now they are really doing well. In fact, they are really well looked after. You know, there's a massive sort of military campaign taking place every now and again when they ring some of the chicks. You know, you're not allowed anywhere near them. Only specialized people who have special ringing permits can go near them. They go to the nest, they take the young out of the nest to put the ring on their legs. It's all done very sort of professionally and very kind of swiftly, and then the birds are up again walking around. But it's an incredible bird. It's bigger than the storks we get in Europe. Lovely sort of clear eyes there and dark bill, and it's a fantastic story, which again is a talking itself. It's just a great illustration of how you can be organic and actually look after the countryside and look after the way you produce food and still make profits and still be able to live a good life. In Australia, I've only been to one place, and that's Darwin. And I remember walking around the botanical garden in Darwin and coming across this guy, a rufous owl, twice the size of a tawny owl. It's a big bugger. And I was so delighted because they're pretty rare. They're only sort of one territory in every 50 kilometers. So to discover this bird, who wasn't that impressed with us, was just absolutely incredible. But when people ask me what's my favorite continent, I have to say without any doubt, you probably know already because it hasn't come up yet, it's got to be Europe, including Britain, because it's the familiarity. It's the fact that, you know, I could be in Europe and I recognize most of the birds because I've grown up looking at books. And in fact, one of the first books I looked at, in fact, the first book I looked at was this one, which I took from the library when I was 7, and I haven't brought it back yet because I'm not finished with it. But I remember looking at this book and seeing the ring ouzel and thinking, wow, this bird looks so much like a blackbird, but in reality, it actually is very different. It's got a crap song. It's a summer visitor to the UK. It's very shy. There's only like 9 or maybe 6,000 pairs and decreasing compared to 8 or 9 million pairs of blackbird. They're found in the very wild areas of Wales, you know, the West Country in Scotland. And I thought, when will I ever see one? Again, to cut another long story short, the fact is that this bird comes to see me at my local patch in Wormer Scrubs, and plus I've even discovered them in Spain as well. So we have a spiritual connection, and again, that's another subject for another talk. And here's said bird. Absolutely love this bird. I can't tire of seeing ring ouzels. I love them. And the other bird I need to talk about, and I have to talk about because for me it's one of the most amazing discoveries, is the fact that in northern Serbia, which you probably know about, but it's in the Balkans. Well, actually, it's in the Balkans, but it's actually in Southeast Europe. Um, it's the best place in the world to see this guy, long-eared owls. And this time of year, I lead tours to Serbia to see these birds in urban areas, and I just can't. Again, I can't tire of walking down the streets, bringing people with me some of whom never seen an owl before in real life, proper wild owl, and to see numbers that are just breathtaking. My jaw drops every year, and I've been doing it for 14 years, and I still can't believe it. And there's one place in particular called Kikinda, where in the town square, sometimes it's like walking into a Harry Potter set. You can see upwards of, well, the record's 800, but you can see upwards of 400 long-eared owls all looking down at you from the junipers. I mean, it's just incredible. And this is a great example of how things were found in the middle of somewhere. People tend to think that you need to go in the middle of nowhere to see things, but if we just open our eyes, our hearts, our minds, our ears, we can see so much just around us. And this discovery was made maybe 15 years ago, no more than that. And my colleagues in Serbia have been doing countless surveys to find out exactly how many owls are wintering in these areas and why. They discovered there's probably around about 35,000 owls along the northern edge of Serbia, and they are roosting in urban areas because the surrounding countryside, the woodlands, have been chopped down, which actually was a happy accident, because it meant that they can roost in towns and cities which were slightly warmer because of the city island effect, heat island effect. So they can roost in slightly warmer conditions. Also, they are not going to be hunted, especially now, because they are revered by the locals, whereas 15 years ago and before then, they were seen and deemed as birds of doom and actually often killed. Now, they are a tourist attraction. Now, ecotourism has taken over. Now, you can come to Kikinda, walk around the square, buy a t-shirt with an owl or tea towel or a cup, with an owl on it. Now the kids are taught about the owls at school. In November, the whole month has been dedicated to owls. In Serbia, owls are called Sova, so they've renamed November Savember, and the kids, act out owl stories and dress up as owls. And the best thing of all is that the town square here, which is an ordinary innocuous square in Serbia, has been made a national nature reserve, the first of its kind in the world. Anyone caught disturbing the owls, particularly around now, Christmas time, could be fined up to 10,000 euros. That is amazing. That just shows you the power of conservation. If we can educate people to look around us and realize that actually it's so important to have these creatures amongst us. Again, I can talk about this all night, but I think it's so important to keep an eye around us and see what's going on, to try and make our gardens, or an element of our garden, wild, so we can start this mosaic of habitats around the whole of Britain, the whole world. We need to protect wildlife, and conservation starts from the doorstep. Even if you live in an apartment block or block of flats, your flower pot on your windowsill is part of that ecosystem. It's connected to the Amazon, it's connected to the Congo, it's connected to the Arctic. It's all connected. We are all connected. And I think that urban birding and appreciating wildlife in urban areas is the first step, because most of us live there in urban areas, and we need to club together and get more people involved to create what I deem and what I call the conservation army, who may not necessarily be out there with binoculars, but they will be at least aware that there's a door that says environment written on it, and they will be sympathetic to causes. They'll dip into their pockets to donate. They'll pick out their pens or click on their keyboards to join in surveys or to sign petitions. So that's, for me, the role of my job, to try and open people's eyes to the nature that's all around us. So with that, I've probably gone on maybe a bit too long, But I just want to thank you again for listening to me. I mean, I'm so, I mean, 16 years on, in fact, not even 16 years on, my whole lifetime on, I'm still as excited, in fact, more excited about the nature around us and the need for us to protect it. And part of that is to try and show people just what is around us. So get out there and keep looking up. And thanks very much for your time.
David, Anjali, could you put your video back on? I need to bring you back.
Not letting me do it. It says you've stopped it.
Oh, hold on. We got logged out. 1 second. Or try again.
Hi. Thank you. Well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I feel like I've been around the world today, so that's fantastic. That we have a long list of places that I certainly need to go to check out some birds. There's been lots of questions, and let's see. I am going to start off with the most recent ones, if that's okay, because those long-eared owls. So many questions about them. Is what do they feed on?
The owls in Serbia they eat the rodents, and basically in the countryside, the farming is very much like the farming methods are very much like what Britain was maybe 200 years ago. So it's very low intensity. They don't harvest all the grain or the crop, so there's lots of grain still left on the ground. The barns have no walls, which means that, again, it's rodent paradise. So there's millions of rodents, and during the day these animals are fed upon by kestrels, and at night by owls. And my colleagues in Serbia have actually worked out that for farmers it's much more profitable, beneficial to have natural pesticides, i.e. to get birds like the long-eared owls to be feeding on the actual rodents than actually to try and poison them, because you're spending far less money, in fact no money, to get the owls to do it, and secondly you're not endangering yourselves or other people with the chemicals you're using, as well as the wildlife. So it's a really beneficial scenario, and there's good years and there's bad years, like with lemmings. Some years some birds starve, or they turn on the collared doves that roost with them, or blue tits or what have you. And other years they just feed solely on the rodents. But yeah, they feed on rodents predominantly. I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Can you not hear me?
I can hear you now. I can hear you now, yeah.
Okay, great. So there's just a little bit of a lag. There's a lot of questions really about kind of your experiences and what you like to do and how you go about birding. So one of the questions is, do you tend to stake out areas for a long time, or do you tend to kind of see things on the go as you're moving around?
Excuse me. I'm very much a patch watcher, which means I love to visit a certain spot or quite regularly. So for example, when I was in London all the time, I'll be at Wormwood Scrubs several times a week, and I'd rather go there than to go somewhere random like in Norfolk or what have you. But that said, I also go to random places. I mean, for example, in Extremadura, where I am now, I do have regular spots I go to, but then I like to explore, and it's all about just keeping your eye out and just seeing what you see. There is an art to birding, and I think over time you begin to realize or recognize certain habitats that could be good, because you've seen that similar habitat elsewhere and you've seen certain things within that habitat elsewhere, so you kind of expect to see possibly the same things you saw before. So it kind of works like that. And also you become very observant, because you're there, you're watching and you're seeing something, that's, and you start clocking stuff. So I think it's a mixture of both. And I think to get to the point where you can actually drift around places and spot things, for me, it's all about having a local patch, because that's where you hone your skills. That's where you cut your teeth. That's where you begin to understand movements of birds, migrations, because if you stay in one spot the whole year round, you notice that in spring, an influx of birds come in and they pass through. And then in summer, you got another lot of birds, including the residents that stay. You notice the differences in populations. And I think that really teaches you a lot subliminally. You don't realize it until you actually start living it elsewhere, and you suddenly realize, that's interesting. And you kind of apply the same kind of thinking elsewhere. So it's all about being observant, and it's all about keeping your heart and your mind open to the idea that anything can turn up anywhere at any time. If someone gives you a list of the birds that turn up in a certain spot, take it politely, take a look at it even, and then scrunch it up, throw it over your shoulder when they're not looking, backheel it into a bin, and then start afresh with a clean slate. And that's how you start seeing things.
Yeah, I loved your tip about the building sites, actually, because that's not something that would occur to me at all, of course, but clearly I need to start paying more attention when I'm in them. Let's see. A lot of the questions are also about exactly that, people noticing things in areas that they're familiar with that have changed. And so one question was actually about blackbirds, and whether, I think I can only see part of the question actually, but there was a decrease in blackbirds through time in their local area, and moving in of green parakeets, and whether there was a relationship between that. If there's a relationship between green parakeets in urban areas and declines in some of the birds that that are native, such as the blackbirds.
Okay, well, there's been research done with the parakeet you're talking about is the rose ring parakeet or the ring-necked parakeet, and their relationship with other birds, and do they compete? The biggest possibility, or the biggest area that they could possibly compete, is for nesting, because they nest in holes, so they would potentially compete with starlings and nuthatches, for example. As far as I'm aware, research has shown that actually hasn't really happened. Even at my patch in Wormwood Scrubs, I remember seeing a tree which had several holes. The top hole was occupied by a woodpecker, the second hole a parakeet, the third hole a starling. So it was like a tenement block, they're actually living side by side. They can be bullies at the bird table, and research has shown that they actually cause smaller birds to stress out a little bit, should I say. I'm not sure how a blackbird would feel about it, because they're not really, they can look after themselves. But often people say to me, have my blackbirds decreased? And some of the reason for that is the fact that in late summer, after the breeding is finished, adults in particular sort of skulk away because they're molting. And when they molt, they keep their heads down, because that's when they're most vulnerable to predation, because they can not fly as well. And then suddenly in the autumn, you suddenly see loads of blackbirds, and that's because they've sort of come out of hiding almost. But on top of that, there's also an influx of birds in varying numbers from Scandinavia that move into Britain as well. So there is a flux of numbers. And it's interesting, this whole migration question, because you think of migration as being swallows leaving, all of them, every single last one of them leaving and heading to Africa, when in reality, some species like the blackbird, in some areas they are sedentary, they stay in one spot, but in other populations are very migratory, and you can't tell the difference. You don't know who's who. In fact, my good friend Bill Oddie once said, if you opened up your back door and saw birds in your back garden, and if they were speaking in human language, you'd be hearing Polish, Norwegian, German, Spanish, but all the birds would be starlings, robins, blackbirds. You can never tell. It's fascinating.
Question about what you've been observing, that's quite timely, which is, have you seen much impact of avian flu in urban areas in any bird population?
I have in the UK. I remember where was I? I was in Nottingham, I think, in October, and I saw, some Canada geese that were not very well at all. It's affected predominantly water birds and seabirds, like gannets in particular. So far anyway. So I've seen some elements of that. Here in Spain, I'm inland, and I have not really seen any evidence of it at all, thankfully. But yes, I've seen evidence in some urban areas. But the other thing is that some birds become sick in parks because of the food that they're being fed by general public. a lot of parks and park authorities are now saying, putting a ban on feeding birds, which, to a point I totally agree with, because white bread in particular is awful for birds. I've seen crows, a lot of the crows have white feathers in their plumage. That's some kind of dietary defect, which is not a good thing. And that's often down to eating white bread, because white bread has no nutritional value at all. But I also think that feeding birds is a great way to engage, especially kids, in the park. So maybe the best way around it, if you can, is to try and feed them with higher grade food. But yeah, in terms of, and the ones that do get ill, and often, you might think it's because of bird flu or something else, but they do actually get ill because of it. But yeah, I have seen evidence of bird flu in urban areas.
Or do you have any suggestions for places in London that people should go if they want to start getting into birding?
Yeah, I mean, I always say that there's no place like home. If you got a house and a garden, then that's a great place to start. That's where I started. If you have a local park, then go to your local park. I mean, you don't have to go anywhere. And that's the thing that's always been kind of sold to us, the idea that you need to go from point A to B before you can start seeing birds or other wildlife, when in reality it's all around us. And that's basically what I've been trying to talk about for the last 16 years as an urban birder, in that you don't need to go anywhere. So you can actually notice quite a lot of wildlife around you. I've been in people's gardens asking me the very same question, and next thing I see a kingfisher whiz past, and I'm thinking, well, hang on, you're nowhere near a river. There you go. It shows you that anything can turn up anywhere at any time. So you need to have an open mind, look at your garden, start in your garden, start locally, and actually start watching birds there. And then you can branch out and go to places like in London, like the London Wetland Centre or the Walthamstow Wetlands Centre, or, Rainham RSPB marshes, or you can, go to other spots. But I think birding is everywhere. I mean, the scene behind me, I'm standing in this particular picture, I was standing on top of Tower 42 near Liverpool Street, and I spent 9 years, not totally, but every spring and autumn, I'd stand on top of this building for several hours at a time, watching migrating birds. And this is not a spot you'd ever think of watching birds. So birds are everywhere. And I think start where you are. Make it easy for yourself.
Fantastic. What's the most surprising bird that you've spotted in London?
That is a tough question, because I'm seeing surprising things every day. And it's hard to actually even start thinking. I mean, for example, I found in Wormwood Scrubs on December the 5th, back in 2005, a bird called a common redstart, which is normally a summer visiting bird and not that much in London, even, as they just basically pass through London. But this bird was actually wintering in Wormwood Scrubs, and it turned out to be Britain's second ever record for wintering common redstart. And then there was a bird that turned up in Chingford back in the 90s, and it's called a Nauman's thrush, all the way from Siberia. There's only ever been one, and that was it. It's never turned up since, so. But then there's other surprising things, like, for example, my mum's garden in Wembley, and I saw a coal tit in her garden. I've never seen one before in all my life. And the coal tit's not a rare bird, but for me, it was like, wow, it's incredible, coal tit. That's amazing. So it depends, for me, it's not about the rarity value. It's about what it feels for, how you feel about it. It's how it makes you feel.
There's a question about tits, which is that somebody said that, they used to have tons of them, even last year, but this year they've hardly seen any at their same feeders. So they used to get tons of blue tits and great tits, but now they only just see robins and starlings. Seen anything along those lines?
So someone's saying that they haven't got any tits in their gardens.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
there's no easy answer for that, because generally speaking, the tits have been doing quite well. It could be down to several reasons. It could be the gardens around you. Maybe there's people that have chopped down vegetation. Maybe it's become more, astroturfed and sterile wooden fencing, because that is a great driver out of birds. That kills any kind of social scenario. So that could be a reason. It depends on, depends on where that person is, really. I think generally speaking, there has been no real decrease in those birds. It's just that maybe there's a local problem to that garden.
Okay, that's good to know. Oh, a couple of questions about, is it okay to feed wild birds the wild bird seed mixes? But if you're, if you can keep up the supply reliably, or does it cause them deficiencies?
There's a lot of discussion about bird feeding at the moment, and some of it's very well researched and actually valid points. I mean, personally, I back feeding birds and even feeding birds all year round. I think it's a great supplementary situation for breeding adults who might occasionally want to sort of take a break and almost like go to McDonald's and have a bit of fast food now and again. But naturally, they tend to go for their natural food until it runs out, and then they can come to your feeders. I think the main problem is two things. Firstly, you need to make sure that the food you're using or putting out there is of good quality. So if you're putting out seed mixes, for example, if you get cheap and cheerful seed mix from the corner shop, there's going to be quite a lot of cereal mix in that as well, which is going to attract pigeons. It's not really that great. You may be better off paying a little bit more and getting some decent or better sort of quality food, which will then sort of hopefully get rid of those birds, as well as buying equipment that will also help you to detract pigeons and other larger birds like parakeets, for example. The other thing is hygiene is so important to keep your bird feeders clean. I mean, would you eat from the same dish every day without cleaning it? Of course you wouldn't. So think about the same thing for birds, because otherwise it's a great way of spreading disease. And there's been research that's linked the decrease of birds like chaffinch and greenfinch with bird feeders because of the fact that, they're soiled with droppings and there's, everyone's going there. So therefore they're just mixing this disease around amongst themselves. So if you can clean your feeders at least once every other week, and every now and again just move the feeder if you can to another location, but still away from potential predation. So that's one thing to do. The other thing is, if you want to contact me directly, I have links with a particular company who can offer really nice discounts on bird food. So if you drop me a line, I can give you a discount code and you can get some really decent food for slightly less money.
See, just a couple of more questions about what your favorites are. So one is, what is us these together? One is, what are your favorite bird spots? And another one is, since you've traveled all over as a birder, what's the best place that you've seen? And was that actually because of the birds? Or do you have a favorite place that has nothing to do with birds, actually?
So the first question is, what are my favorite birds to spot?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to take it as a family of birds, and I'm very much a wetlands. I love wetlands. I love open spaces. It's taken me all my life to realize that I'm not a great fan of walking around forests and jungles, and even I just chasing shadows and hearing things a mile away and people telling me, oh, that's or whatever. It doesn't really turn me on, but I like the idea of open, because I think it's because of the way I was brought up. I was brought up in London. I wasn't next to any forests or anything. I was, going to the park. So I was seeing an open vista the whole time. I was looking out my back window across my garden. So I was seeing an open vista the whole time. So I've kind of trained myself to be more observant, looking at things flying and seeing things on water. So wetland species, particularly shorebirds, I love. But I also love other birds like thrushes and pipits that also, well, some of them inhabit areas of open ground. The second part of the question was what?
Favorite place. What's the best place that you've been, and was that because of the birds?
Well, the thing is, the best place could be my back garden on the day. There is no, for me, that's not an easy question to answer. I mean, there's places I love being in. I mean, I love being in Extremadura, for example. When I'm in London, my local patch, despite the fact of its decimation by HS2, is still the place that I love. It hurts my heart whenever I go there now. But anyway, it's places like there, and I think it could be anywhere. I mean, it could be somewhere you've been several times before. The next day you turn up, it's just amazing for whatever reason. I mean, there's places I visited. I went to Ethiopia, as I said, and I went Kenya. I went to Kenya, and I went to a particular place in Kenya, and it was just amazing. You know, so many different things around. Recently, I went to Costa Rica. That was great. But then I'm just as happy traveling around the UK. You know, I was on the Isle of Lundy. I'm an ambassador for the Isle of Lundy, and I was on there. I didn't see a massive amount of things, but for me, it was great. I loved it, and I want to go back. You know, it's not about numbers of birds. It's not about the quality in inverted commas. It's about the experience, the general experience. You know, how you feel, how it makes you feel, how good it makes you feel. You know, I judge that question on that, really, on the fact that, you know, how it makes me feel. It's not so much the numbers of birds, even though that obviously helps. But sometimes when you don't see any birds, you still feel great.
With all that you've done about birds and birding, do you think about your work in relation to other people that write about birds? They specifically mention Drew Lanham in the States and Gene Stratton. Do you take inspiration from other writers as well, or how do you feel like your work kind of fits in with that kind of the breadth of things that people have written about birding?
No, listen, I it's interesting question. It's very, very interesting question because you know, I totally and utterly respect people like Drew, and you know, there's quite a lot of people in America actually that I really, really look up to in terms of what they've done. And also in the UK, there's some, and in Europe, there's some, and even across the world, there's some really interesting people you never hear of, and some you do hear of, but they're just brilliant in terms of their dedication and the work they've done and the discoveries they've made. I feel very envious of them in that respect. But I also feel it's my job to be out there telling the world about the work that they do, basically, which is what I do half the time. But it's funny because I remember once someone asking me, who are your inspirations? And expecting me to say David Attenborough or something. And okay, David Attenborough is a don, absolutely. But my big inspirations are people like Prince and George Best. And the reason why I cite those two is the fact that they were ahead of their time. They cut a path that now everyone follows as part of life, you know, but before then they had to cut a difficult path. They were talented people who came from a very different background, who made a difference. And when I see that inspires me no end. And I always think to myself, if I can do something similar, but in my world, that would be brilliant. You know, one of my biggest inspirations was actually a birder called Peter Grant, who, excuse me, who was the one of the fathers of a book called the Collins Bird Guide, which for us birders is the Bible. And I was lucky enough to be mentored by him when I was 18, 19 years old. And he knew so much, but he was so free with his knowledge, you know. And I thought to myself then, if I just knew 5% of what he knew, I'll be out there telling the world. Unfortunately, he died in 1990, but I always think about him, and I always think to myself, you know, it's my duty to try and help as many people as I can. You know, if someone taps me on the shoulder and asks me what I'm looking at, instead of saying, oh, whatever, I'll explain this is what it is and that's why it's doing whatever it's doing. I think it's important to try and at least share what you have, because it's a joy. And I love when you share, you see people's smiles, you know, and oh, I didn't realize that, I'll look out for that again in the future. And then you think to yourself, job done, you know. So that's what brings me excitement. And when I see other people doing that, not only in my field but in other fields, I have to respect it.
It is an absolutely brilliant note to end on, a really inspirational way of ending this fantastic talk. There are a few more questions left in the Q&A, but I think we've probably run over by too much now, and I think we could probably keep talking about this for hours, quite frankly. So thank you so much for an absolutely fantastic talk, and for inspiring all of us to just pay attention to the world around us. So thank you again, David, and thanks to all of you for attending, and hope you all have a lovely holiday.
Thank you.